The mistake I made wasn't reporting the fraud, I said near the end. That was required. The mistake was approving his contract in the first place, without disclosure. I let personal feelings, trust in my spouse, desire to avoid awkward conversations, override professional obligations. That's where the ethical failure occurred. I talked about the mandatory leave, the therapy, the slow process of rebuilding trust with my board and my team, about learning to separate personal feelings from professional decisions, not by eliminating the feelings impossible, but by acknowledging them and then setting them aside. You will face situations where personal relationships complicate professional obligations, I concluded. The question isn't whether you will have feelings about those situations. You will. The question is, what you do with those feelings. Do you let them drive your decisions? Or do you acknowledge them, set them aside, and make decisions based on policy and evidence? The applause was thunderous. People stood. I saw Caroline and Angela on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. During the Q&A, a session, hands shot up immediately. A woman in the back asked, "How did you rebuild your credibility after such a public failure?" Slowly, I said honestly. I owned my mistake, didn't make excuses or blame others. I took the consequences, the reprimand, the mandatory leave, and used them to learn. Then I came back and proved through consistent action that I could maintain appropriate boundaries. A man near the front. Do you regret reporting your husband? No. That was the right thing to do, regardless of my personal feelings. What I regret is putting myself in a position where personal and professional obligations conflicted so severely. Another woman, how do you handle situations now where family or friends want special treatment? With complete transparency. If someone I know applies for a position at my company, I disclose the relationship immediately and recuse myself from any hiring decisions. I've learned that attempting to be objective in those situations is impossible. Better to remove myself entirely. The questions continued for 30 minutes. People wanted specifics, wanted to understand how I'd navigated the aftermath, what systems I'd put in place to prevent similar failures. When the session finally ended, I was exhausted but satisfied. This was why I'd agreed to speak publicly about my failure, because other people needed to know that even experienced professionals made mistakes and that recovery was possible. Caroline and Angela found me backstage. "That was incredible," Caroline said, hugging me. "Brave and honest and exactly what people needed to hear. You had half the room in tears," Angela added. "Including me, I just told the truth about what happened and what I learned." That's what made it powerful. You didn't try to spin it or make yourself look better. You just owned it. We went to lunch at a restaurant near the conference center, sat in a booth by the window, ordered salads and wine, decompressed from the intensity of the morning. "Can I ask you something?" Angela said after our food arrived. "And I want the real answer, not the polished version you give to audiences." "Okay. Do you ever wish you'd handled things differently with Blake? Not reporting him, but how you reported him. The timing, the thoroughness, the calculated nature of it?" I thought about that. It was a question I'd asked myself hundreds of times over the past 5 years. "Yes and no," I said finally. "I wish I'd disclosed the conflict of interest when I approved his contract. That was a clear mistake. But the reporting itself, the investigation, I did what I had to do. If I'd confronted Blake privately first, he would have lied, would have convinced me it was a mistake, that he'd fix it, and I would have wanted to believe him. So the calculated approach was necessary? It was necessary to ensure proper documentation and consequences. But Angela, I'm not going to pretend my motives were pure. I was hurt and angry. I wanted Blake to face maximum consequences. The fact that those consequences were also professionally appropriate doesn't erase the personal satisfaction I felt. And you're okay with that now? With having wanted him to suffer? I'm okay with being honest about it. I wanted revenge. I got it. It didn't make me feel as good as I expected, and it cost more than I anticipated. But I don't regret holding him accountable. Caroline had been quiet during this exchange. Now she spoke up. Can I tell you something about how it looked from my perspective? Please. When you reported Blake, when the investigation started, I thought you were incredibly brave. You knew it would blow up your marriage and damage your reputation, but you did it anyway because it was right. That's real integrity. Not the easy kind where doing the right thing costs nothing. The hard kind where it costs everything. I didn't feel brave. I felt vindictive. Maybe you were both. Maybe that's okay. Caroline sipped her wine. You know what I learned from watching you go through that? That integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about making hard choices even when you have complicated feelings about them. We finished lunch and headed back to the conference center. I had a smaller breakout session that afternoon, then a dinner with some of the other speakers. By the time I got back to my hotel room that evening, I was completely drained, kicked off my heels, changed into comfortable clothes, and collapsed on the bed. My phone showed several messages. One from Harold, heard your keynote was phenomenal. Proud to have you representing TechCore. One from Felix, Blake's cousin who I'd recused myself from hiring years ago, watched the live stream of your speech. Thank you for being so honest about the challenges of maintaining ethics when relationships are involved. It's making me better at my job. And one from an unknown number. This is Blake. I was at the conference, sat in the back. Your speech was powerful. Thank you for telling our story in a way that might help others avoid our mistakes. I hope you're well. I stared at that last message for a long time. Blake had been there, had listened to me discuss our marriage, our failures, the painful consequences we'd both faced. I typed back, "Thank you for being okay with me sharing our story. I hope Seattle is treating you well." His response came quickly. "Seattle is good. I'm married again to someone patient enough to deal with my baggage, and I'm still in therapy, still working on the honesty thing. Your speech reminded me why that work matters. I'm glad. You deserved a second chance. So did you. Sounds like you took it and built something meaningful." We exchanged a few more messages, brief updates, well wishes, the kind of conversation you'd have with someone you used to know well but had moved on from. It was cordial without being friendly, distant without being cold. When the conversation ended, I felt something I hadn't expected. Closure, real closure. Not the legal kind that comes with divorce papers, but the emotional kind that comes from both people acknowledging mistakes and moving forward. Blake had learned from what happened, so had I. We'd both become better people through the painful process of destroying our marriage. That was something, at least. The rest of the conference passed in a blur of meetings and networking and conversations with other HR professionals. Many of them approached me privately to thank me for my honesty, to share their own stories of navigating complicated ethical situations. One woman pulled me aside after a panel discussion. "I'm dealing with something similar right now. My brother applied for a job at my company, and I approved his application without thinking twice. Now someone's questioning whether that's appropriate. Disclose the relationship immediately," I advised. "Recuse yourself from the hiring process. Let someone else make the objective decision. It might feel like you're abandoning your brother, but you're actually protecting both of you. What if he doesn't get the job? Then he doesn't get it. But at least no one can question whether nepotism played a role, and your professional integrity stays intact." She thanked me, looking relieved to have clear guidance. That was the value of sharing my failure publicly. It gave other people permission to acknowledge their own struggles, to ask for help before situations became catastrophic. Flying home Sunday evening, I felt different. Lighter, like I'd finally transformed my biggest professional mistake into something useful. The guilt hadn't disappeared entirely, probably never would, but it had shifted from a crushing weight to a reminder: don't let personal feelings override professional standards. Maintain boundaries. Be honest about conflicts of interest. Simple principles that I'd violated once and would never violate again. Back in my apartment, I'd sold the house Blake and I had shared, bought a smaller place downtown I unpacked and settled in. The space was entirely mine, decorated to my taste, filled with things that mattered to me. No compromises, no shared decisions, just my life, my space, my choices. It had taken 5 years to get comfortable with that independence, to stop reaching for someone who wasn't there, to enjoy solitude rather than just enduring it. But now I liked living alone, liked making decisions without consultation, liked the freedom of being entirely responsible for my own happiness. Monday morning, back at TechCore, I had coffee with Harold in his office. "The conference reviews are excellent," he said, pulling up numbers on his computer. "Your keynote has been shared widely. Several other companies have reached out asking if you'd be willing to speak at their events." That's good. It's more than good. It's valuable. You've taken a difficult situation and turned it into thought leadership. The board is very pleased. I'm glad the company is getting value from my mistakes." Harold looked at me seriously. "Catherine, you know that's not what this is about. We're not exploiting your pain for corporate benefit. We're recognizing that you learned something valuable and are generous enough to share it. I know, sometimes it still feels strange being rewarded for a failure. You're not being rewarded for the failure. You're being recognized for how you handled the aftermath. There's a difference." He was right. The failure had been approving Blake's contract without disclosure. The success had been owning that mistake, learning from it, and helping others navigate similar situations. That distinction mattered. The rest of the day was normal work meetings, emails, personnel decisions, the comfortable routine of a job I'd spent years mastering. As I was leaving that evening, Caroline caught me in the hallway. "Dinner tonight? There's something I want to talk to you about." "Sure. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Just want your advice on something." We met at a bistro near the office, ordered wine and appetizers, made small talk about the conference and work, and Caroline's recent vacation. Then she said, "I'm thinking about applying for VP positions at other companies. Not leaving TechCore necessarily, but exploring options. And I wanted to ask, how do I know when I'm ready?" I smiled. "You're asking if you're ready to be me?" "Sort of. You've built an incredible career. I want to know how you knew you were ready for each promotion, each new challenge. Honestly, I never felt completely ready. I just felt ready enough to try and confident I could learn what I didn't know. I sipped my wine. But Caroline, you're more than ready. You've been essentially doing VP level work for 2 years. You just need the title to match. What if I make mistakes? What if I mess up the way you did with Blake? You will make mistakes, different ones than mine, but you'll make them. The question is what you'll do when that happens. Will you own them? Learn from them? Use them to become better? I hope so. I know so. You're one of the most thoughtful, ethical people I know. You'll do great. We talked for another hour about career strategy, professional development, the challenges of leadership. By the end of dinner, Caroline looked more confident. "Thank you," she said as we parted ways, "for believing in me and for being honest about your own struggles. It makes success feel more achievable." Driving home, I thought about that, about how sharing my failure had helped people like Caroline feel less alone in their own challenges. Maybe that was the real redemption. Not rebuilding my own career, but helping others build theirs. Not hiding my mistakes, but using them to light the way for people coming behind me. 5 years ago, I'd destroyed Blake's career and nearly destroyed my own. Had faced consequences that felt crushing, had questioned everything about who I was and what I valued. But from those ashes, I'd built something new, not just a career, but a purpose, not just professional success, but personal growth. I'd become someone who maintained standards, not because they were convenient weapons, but because they mattered. Someone who acknowledged complicated feelings but didn't let them drive unethical decisions. Someone who had learned the hard way that integrity was worth more than revenge. And that person flawed, scarred, but wiser was someone I could finally respect. That was worth every painful step of the journey. 7 years after the divorce, I received an invitation that made my stomach drop. TechCore was hosting its annual industry summit, and Blake's Seattle firm had been invited to present on a major infrastructure project they'd completed. The conference coordinator wanted my approval since Blake would be on our campus. I stared at the email for a long time, my coffee going cold beside me. 7 years. I hadn't seen Blake in person since that final mediation session. We'd exchanged occasional messages, birthday, wishes, congratulations on promotions, the polite distance of people who'd once been intimate and were now just acquaintances. But seeing him in person, at my company, that felt different. I forwarded the email to Dr. Barnes, my therapist. We'd reduced our sessions to monthly check-ins over the years, but I still valued her perspective on complicated situations. She called me within an hour. "How are you feeling about this?" she asked. "Uncertain. It's been 7 years. I've moved on." But having him here, at TechCore, presenting about his success, it feels loaded with symbolism. What kind of symbolism? That he recovered, built a new career, found success despite everything that happened. Meanwhile, I'm still here, still at the company where it all fell apart. Are you unhappy at TechCore? I thought about that. No. I love my job. I've built something meaningful here. But there's this voice in my head saying, I should have moved on too, started fresh somewhere else. Catherine, you did start fresh. You rebuilt your reputation here, which is actually harder than starting over somewhere new. You faced the people who knew about your failure and proved you could grow from it. So I should approve his presentation? I think you should make the decision based on what's best for the conference, not on your personal feelings. Can his firm contribute valuable content? Yes. Their infrastructure project is impressive. Exactly the kind of innovation we want showcased. Then approve it and trust yourself to handle seeing him professionally. I took her advice, approved the presentation. Then I did something that surprised me. I volunteered to be Blake's point of contact for the event. If I was going to face this, I might as well face it directly. The conference was 6 weeks away. I used that time to prepare mentally, to remind myself that I was no longer the woman who'd reported Blake out of hurt and anger. I was someone who'd learned, grown, built a life I was proud of. Blake and I exchanged emails about logistics, travel arrangements, equipment needs, schedule coordination. Professional, cordial. No acknowledgement of our history beyond a brief note from him. Thank you for making this possible. I know it might be uncomfortable having me there. I'd replied simply, your firm earned the invitation based on merit. Personal history is irrelevant. The week of the conference arrived. Monday morning, I watched Blake's name appear on the attendee check-in list. He was here, in the building. Somewhere in the 3 floors TechCore occupied. I focused on my responsibilities, welcoming speakers, managing logistics, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Didn't go looking for Blake, figured we'd cross paths when we cross paths. It happened Tuesday afternoon. I was in the main conference hall reviewing the setup for evening presentations when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Catherine. I turned. Blake stood 10 feet away, looking older but healthier than I remembered. His hair had more grey, his face had more lines, but he looked content, settled, like he'd found peace with himself. Blake, welcome to TechCore. I kept my voice professional, my expression neutral. Thank you for having us. The conference is impressive. You've done incredible work here. It's a team effort. Your presentation is tomorrow at 2, conference room B. Do you need anything? Actually, could we talk? Somewhere private? Just for a few minutes? I hesitated. Professional Catherine said to keep boundaries, maintain distance, but human Catherine was curious about what he wanted to say. Okay, there's a quiet lounge on the 3rd floor. Follow me. We rode the elevator in silence, walked to a small lounge area with windows overlooking the city, sat in chairs facing each other, maintaining careful distance. I wanted to thank you, Blake said, for approving our presentation. I know that couldn't have been easy. It was the right thing to do professionally. Your project deserves recognition. Still, you could have found reasons to exclude us. No one would have questioned it. I'm not the person who makes decisions based on personal history anymore. I learned that lesson the hard way. He nodded. I heard your keynote speech. The recorded version, it's been shared in HR circles. It was honest, painful to listen to, but honest. I'm sorry if it was difficult for you. I tried to protect your privacy while still being truthful about what happened. You did fine. And Catherine, you were right about all of it. I was dishonest. I defrauded your company. I tried to exploit your position. I deserved the consequences. You've said that before. I know. But I wanted to say it again, in person, after 7 years of therapy and growth, and actually becoming someone different. I'm not the man you married. I'm not even the man you divorced. I've done the work to understand why I lied, why I cut corners, why I felt entitled to benefit from your success while dismissing it. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. found only genuine remorse. I'm glad you've grown. Everyone deserves that chance. You've grown too. The conference, your reputation in the industry, the way people talk about you with respect you've built, something remarkable. Thank you. We sat in awkward silence for a moment. 7 years of history between us, and we'd run out of safe things to say. I'm married again, Blake said finally. Her name is Sophia. She's a civil engineer. We worked together on the Seattle project. I heard. I'm happy for you. She knows everything. About the fraud, about our marriage, about what I did. I told her before we got serious, because I learned that secrets always come out eventually. That's wise. Are you seeing anyone? I date occasionally. Nothing serious. I'm focused on my career, and honestly, I like living alone. Turns out I'm better at independence than I thought. You were always strong. I just didn't appreciate it. Another silence. This conversation felt like closing a book we'd both already finished reading, necessary, but not particularly meaningful. I should get back to work, I said, standing. Your presentation materials are in room B. If you need anything, Caroline can help. She's my director of employee relations now. Caroline, the assistant who helped with the fraud investigation, the same. She's brilliant. Much better at her job than I was at her age. Blake stood too. Catherine, one more thing. I wanted you to know I don't blame you for reporting me, for the investigation, for any of it. You did what you had to do, and it forced me to become someone better. So thank you. You're welcome. And Blake, I don't regret it either. Not anymore. It was painful, but necessary for both of us. We shook hands, a formal gesture that felt appropriate for who we were now, colleagues in the same industry, former spouses who'd destroyed each other and somehow both survived. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for Blake, but for the journey, for the painful lessons that had made me someone I could respect. For the failures that had taught me what actually mattered. The rest of the conference went smoothly. Blake's presentation was excellent, detailed, innovative, professionally delivered. He received sustained applause and multiple questions about the project. Watching him present, I felt no jealousy, no residual anger, just acknowledgement that he'd rebuilt his career successfully. That we'd both survived the destruction of our marriage and found ways forward. Thursday evening, the conference concluded with a networking reception. I circulated through the crowd, talking to attendees, accepting congratulations on a successful event. Blake approached me near the end of the evening, Sophia beside him. She was petite, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that assessed me carefully. Catherine, this is my wife, Sophia. I shook her hand. Pleasure to meet you. Your presentation yesterday was insightful. The structural innovations you developed are impressive. Thank you. Blake mentioned you two were married once. I wanted to meet the woman who taught him about accountability. I glanced at Blake, surprised he'd described it that way. Sophia continued. He told me everything about what happened, how he defrauded your company and you reported him, how it destroyed his career and forced him to rebuild. He said it was the best thing that ever happened to him, professionally speaking. I'm not sure I'd go that far, I said carefully. I would, Blake interjected. Catherine, I was heading toward disaster. The fraud at TechCore wasn't the first time I'd cut corners, it was just the first time I got caught. If you hadn't reported me, I would have kept doing it until eventually someone else caught me. probably with worse consequences. He's been scrupulously honest since, Sophia added, almost to a fault. He'll spend 30 minutes debating whether something is ethical because he's terrified of sliding back into old patterns. That's good, I said. Vigilance matters. We talked for a few more minutes, safe topics like the conference, industry trends, Seattle versus our city, professional conversation between professional people. When they left, I felt something close to closure. Real closure. The kind that comes from seeing that everyone involved survived and grew and built new lives. Angela found me near the end of the reception. I saw you talking to Blake and his wife. How was that? Surprisingly okay. He's different. We're both different. Good different? And just different. We are not the people we were 7 years ago. And that's fine. We left the conference center together, walked to our cars in the parking garage. You know what I realized watching you this week? Angela said as we reached her car. You've forgiven yourself. Finally, completely forgiven yourself for what happened with Blake. Have I? Yeah. You approved his presentation without hesitation. You talked to him calmly. You weren't trying to prove anything or avoid anything. You were just handling a professional situation professionally. I thought about that. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have forgiven myself. Or maybe I've just finally accepted that I'm human, that I made mistakes and learned from them. That's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. After Angela drove away, I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking up at the TechCore building. 7 years I'd worked here since the Blake situation. 7 years of rebuilding trust, proving competence, helping other people navigate ethical dilemmas. It had been worth it. Not easy, but worth it. My phone buzzed. Text from Caroline. Drinks tomorrow to celebrate conference success? I typed back, absolutely. You pick the place. Friday evening, Caroline and I met at a wine bar downtown. She was glowing with excitement about something, practically bouncing in her seat. Okay, what's going on? I asked after we'd ordered. I got a job offer. VP of HR at a mid-sized tech company in Austin. 20% salary increase, full autonomy over department, chance to build systems from scratch. I felt a pang of loss. Caroline had become invaluable, both professionally and personally. But I pushed that aside. That's incredible. Congratulations. I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Caroline, if this is what you want, you should take it. You're ready for VP level. You have been for a while. But what about TechCore? What about you? TechCore will be fine. We'll hire someone new, I'll train them, the work will continue, and I'll be fine, too sad to lose you, but proud of what you're doing. She looked relieved. I was worried you'd be upset. I'm not upset. I'm grateful I got to work with you and watch you grow. This is what's supposed to happen, people. I mentor. Move on to bigger opportunities. You've taught me so much about ethics, about leadership, about how to maintain integrity in complicated situations. And you've taught me too about resilience, about finding joy in the work, about not taking myself too seriously. We spent the evening celebrating her new opportunity, making plans for her transition, promising to stay in touch. By the time we parted ways, I felt that same bittersweet emotion, loss of something good, but recognition that change was necessary and healthy. Saturday morning, alone in my apartment, I made coffee and sat by the window watching the city wake up. Thought about the past 7 years, about everything that had changed. I'd destroyed Blake's career and nearly destroyed my own. Had faced consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. Had spent years rebuilding, learning, growing. And now Blake was happily remarried with a successful career. Caroline was moving on to bigger opportunities. I was respected in my field, content in my life, at peace with my choices. We'd all survived. More than survived, we'd grown. That was the real lesson I'd learned. Consequences weren't punishments, they were teachers. Failure wasn't final, it was transformative. And revenge, real, effective revenge, wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about refusing to let their betrayal destroy you. Blake had called my job pointless, had tried to benefit from my position while dismissing my work, had committed fraud and expected me to cover for him, and I'd proven him wrong. Not by destroying him, though that had been part of it, but by building something he couldn't touch. A career based on integrity, a reputation built on honest mistakes and honest recovery. A life that was entirely mine. That was the best revenge. Not professional destruction or personal vindication, but simply becoming someone whose worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. My phone buzzed. Email from Harold. Board meeting Tuesday. Want to discuss succession planning. We're thinking about creating a chief ethics officer position. Interested? A new role. New responsibilities. A chance to focus entirely on the work that had become my passion. I typed back, very interested. Let's discuss details Tuesday. 7 years ago, I'd thought my career was over. That I'd destroyed everything I'd built through one ethically questionable decision and a desire for revenge. But I'd been wrong. I'd just been transforming, becoming someone different, someone better. And now, sitting in my apartment with morning light streaming through the windows and possibilities stretching before me, I felt something I'd spent years searching for. Not happiness, exactly. Not vindication or triumph or any of the emotions I'd expected from winning. Just peace. Simple, hard-won, deeply satisfying peace. That was worth every painful lesson, every consequence faced, every moment of doubt and shame and difficult growth. I'd become someone I could respect, someone who maintained standards because they mattered. Someone who'd learned that integrity wasn't about being perfect, it was about being honest about imperfection. Blake had underestimated me, had called my job pointless while his job application said under review. He'd learned his lesson, and I'd learned mine. Now we were both just people who'd made mistakes and grown from them, who'd hurt each other and healed separately. Who'd found ways forward that didn't require the other's destruction or validation. That felt like the real ending, not dramatic or satisfying in the way revenge stories usually ended, just honest, human, real. And somehow that was better than any revenge could ever be. The Chief Ethics Officer position was officially created 3 months after that board meeting. I spent those months transitioning my HR responsibilities to my replacement, a sharp woman named Priya who'd come from a competitor and brought fresh perspectives I valued. Training Priya felt different than training Caroline had. With Caroline, I'd been teaching someone I'd watched grow from assistant to director. With Priya, I was handing over systems I'd built to someone who might change them completely. That required letting go, trusting that the work mattered more than my specific approach to it. "Why did you approve your husband's consulting contract without disclosure?" Priya asked during one of our transition meetings. She'd been studying the ethics training materials I'd developed, including the case study based on my own failure. Honestly, because it felt awkward to make a big deal about it. We'd been married for years. The contract was small. I told myself it wasn't significant enough to warrant formal disclosure. But it was significant. It was. And by the time I realized that, I'd already violated policy, which meant when I discovered his fraud, I couldn't address it without also exposing my own ethical failure. Priya made notes on her tablet. Do you think you would have reported the fraud if you hadn't been personally hurt by his comments at the barbecue? That was the question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. Yes, I said finally. But maybe not as thoroughly. Maybe not with the same level of documentation and strategic timing. My personal feelings accelerated the process and possibly made me more aggressive than necessary. Is that bad? It's complicated. The outcome was appropriate. Blake faced consequences for actual fraud. But my motivations weren't entirely professional. I wanted him to understand that my work wasn't pointless, that I had real power, that underestimating me was a mistake, so revenge and justice coexisted. Exactly. And I've spent years trying to separate them, to understand which parts of my actions were defensible and which parts were vindictive. The conclusion I've reached is that both can be true simultaneously. I did the right thing for partially wrong reasons. Priya considered that. How do you prevent that from happening again? Radical honesty about motivations. When I'm making decisions now, I ask myself, would I make this same decision if I had no personal feelings about the situation? If the answer is yes, I proceed. If the answer is no or uncertain, I recuse myself. That's what I'm supposed to learn from your case study? To be honest about personal motivations? That's part of it. The other part is that even experienced professionals make mistakes, that policies exist for good reasons, that shortcuts, even small ones, have consequences. We spent another hour discussing the transition, going through files and procedures and ongoing situations that would become Priya's responsibility. As she was leaving, she turned back. Thank you for being so honest about your failure. Most people in your position would hide it or spin it to make themselves look better. I tried that for about 6 months. It didn't work. People knew what had happened. The only thing I could control was how I responded to it. By owning it completely, by owning it and using it, failure is only wasted if you don't learn from it. After Priya left, I sat alone in my office, soon to be her office, and looked around. This space had been mine for 7 years. I'd made decisions here that affected hundreds of people's lives, had faced my own failures here, had rebuilt my career here. Now I was moving to a different floor, a different role, a different chapter. The Chief Ethics Officer position came with a smaller office but broader responsibility. I'd be working across all departments, reviewing policies, investigating concerns, training leaders on ethical decision-making. It was exactly what I wanted, what I'd been preparing for without realizing it. My first major project in the new role was developing a company-wide ethics training program. Not just for HR, but for everyone from entry-level employees to executives. I built it around real case studies, including my own, anonymized others, but used mine with full transparency. Let people see that the Chief Ethics Officer had made ethical failures and learned from them. The training launched 6 months into my new position. The response was overwhelming. People appreciated the honesty, the acknowledgement that ethics were complicated, the practical guidance on navigating difficult situations. I also started speaking more, not just at HR conferences, but at business schools and leadership programs, talking about ethical decision-making, conflict of interest, the challenges of maintaining integrity under pressure. One speaking engagement brought me to Seattle, Blake City. I mentioned it to him in a casual email. I'd be in town for 2 days, speaking at the university. He replied immediately, "Would love to get coffee if you have time. Sophia would like to meet you properly." We rushed at the conference. I agreed. Met them at a coffee shop near the university campus on a Saturday morning. Sophia was more relaxed outside the conference environment, funnier than I'd expected. She told stories about Blake's obsessive honesty, how he'd once spent an hour debating whether taking an extra sugar packet from a coffee shop constituted theft. "I created a monster," I joked. "You created someone with a conscience," Sophia corrected. "There's a difference." Blake looked embarrassed but pleased. "I just don't want to slide back. It's easier to maintain strict standards than to figure out where the line is." We talked for 2 hours about their lives in Seattle, about my new role at TechCore, about the industry and the weather, and completely normal things that people who used to be married might discuss. It was pleasant, genuinely pleasant, without the weight of history crushing every interaction. As we were saying goodbye, Sophia hugged me unexpectedly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making him face consequences. I got the better version of Blake because of what you did." After they left, I sat alone with my coffee, processing that comment. 7 years ago, destroying Blake's career had felt like revenge. Now it felt like something more complicated, a painful but necessary intervention that had benefited everyone involved. Blake had become more honest. I'd become more self-aware. We'd both learned that consequences weren't punishments, they were redirections. Flying home from Seattle, I thought about the arc of the past 8 years. From discovering Blake's fraud, to reporting it, to facing my own ethical failures, to rebuilding my career, to finding peace with how everything had unfolded. It hadn't been the revenge story I'd initially imagined. There'd been no moment of pure triumph, no scene where Blake acknowledged my superiority and begged forgiveness. Instead, there'd been messy human consequences, painful growth, difficult lessons learned by everyone involved. That was real life. Not the cinematic version, but the honest version. Back at TechCore, I threw myself into the ethics work with renewed purpose. Developed new training modules. Investigated reported concerns with careful attention to fairness and procedure. Helped leaders navigate complicated situations without letting personal feelings override professional standards. One case particularly challenged me. A senior engineer accused of sexual harassment by 3 different women over 2 years. The engineer was brilliant, responsible for several key patents, seemingly irreplaceable. The executive team wanted to handle it quietly, mandatory training, close monitoring, but no termination. Keep the talent, minimize the disruption. I pushed back hard. "We have clear policies," I said in the executive meeting. "Multiple credible complaints. Documented patterns of behavior. If we don't terminate, we're telling every employee that genius excuses harassment. But the patents belong to the company, not the individual. We can replace one engineer. We can't replace our integrity. It was my Blake situation in reverse. This time, I wasn't the one with personal feelings clouding judgment. I was the one insisting on standards despite inconvenient consequences. The executive team ultimately agreed. The engineer was terminated. 3 women felt heard and protected. The company sent a clear message about values. That felt like redemption too. Not for what I'd done to Blake, but for the lessons I'd learned from that situation. I'd become someone who upheld standards consistently, regardless of who it impacted or what it cost. A year into the Chief Ethics Officer role, Harvard Business Review contacted me about publishing an article on ethical leadership. They'd read my case study, heard my speeches, wanted me to write about maintaining integrity in high-pressure corporate environments. I spent 3 months writing that article. Poured everything I'd learned into it, the importance of disclosure, the danger of shortcuts, the necessity of accountability, the possibility of growth after failure. The article ran with my photo and a headline, "The Ethics Officer Who Started with Unethical Behavior, What 20 Years in HR Taught Me About Integrity." It went viral in professional circles, generated hundreds of comments, mostly positive, some critical, all engaged with the ideas. One comment stood out, from someone named Seattle Engineer. This author reported me for fraud 8 years ago. It destroyed my career and ended our marriage. She was right to do it. I needed those consequences to become someone better. This article captures why ethics matter not as abstract principles, but as practical guides for how we treat each other. Blake. He'd commented publicly, using his real story to reinforce my article's message. I screenshot it and sent it to Dr. Barnes with a message. "I think I've finally forgiven myself, and I think he's finally forgiven me. Maybe we're both finally free," she replied. "Freedom isn't the absence of consequences, it's peace with them. You've found that. Congratulations." That evening, alone in my apartment with a glass of wine and city lights twinkling outside my window, I thought about what Blake had said at the barbecue 8 years ago. Her job? It'll be automated by AI in 5 years, tops. 5 years had passed. Then 8. My job hadn't been automated. If anything, it had become more essential as technology advanced. Human judgment about ethics became more valuable, not less. Blake had been wrong. My work wasn't pointless. It mattered, had always mattered. But I no longer needed him to acknowledge that. I no longer needed anyone's validation to know my worth. That was the real victory. Not destroying Blake's career or proving him wrong publicly. Just becoming someone who knew her own value, independent of anyone else's opinion. My phone buzzed. Email from the board. "We'd like to discuss your future with TechCore. Interested in COO position? Let's talk." Chief Operating Officer, the number 2 position in the company. Responsibility for all operational functions, not just ethics. It was a huge opportunity. Also a huge risk. COO roles demanded different skills, broader perspective, strategic thinking beyond my current focus. I sat with the email for a long time, considering. Part of me wanted to stay in ethics work. It was what I knew, what I was good at, what felt like my calling. But another part remembered that growth required discomfort. That staying safe meant staying small. That the woman who'd reported Blake, despite massive personal costs, was someone capable of bigger challenges. I typed back, "Very interested. Let's discuss specifics." Whatever came next, coup or something else, I'd face it as someone who understood that consequences and growth were inseparable, that maintaining integrity sometimes cost everything, that the best revenge wasn't destruction but transformation. Blake had claimed my job was pointless while his application said under review. Now his application said permanently denied, and my career trajectory said keep rising. But more importantly, we'd both become people who understood that actions have consequences, that growth requires honesty, that the only way forward was through honest acknowledgement of past failures. That was worth more than any revenge could ever be. And sitting there with that COO opportunity glowing on my screen, I felt something I'd spent 8 years searching for. Not vindication or triumph or satisfaction from Blake's downfall. Just peace with who I'd become. And excitement about who I might still become. That was the best ending I could have asked for. The COO interview process took 3 months. Multiple meetings with board members, presentations on operational strategy, discussions about my vision for TechCore's future. It was grueling and exhilarating in equal measure. Angela flew in for one of the final rounds, sitting in my apartment the night before my presentation to the full board. "Are you nervous?" she asked, watching me rehearse for the 3rd time. "Terrified." This is so far outside my comfort zone. Good. That means you're growing. I set down my notes and looked at her. What if I fail? What if I get this position and prove Blake was right, that I'm only good at managing feelings, not real operational work? Catherine, stop. Blake said your job was pointless when you were VP of HR. He was wrong then, and he'd be wrong now. You know, operations, you've been involved in hiring, training, resource allocation, policy development for years. You just haven't had the title. It's different managing ethics versus managing the entire company. Is it? Both require understanding how systems work, how people interact with those systems, where problems emerge, how to fix them. You've been doing this work. You just called it something else. She was right. I was letting Blake's old criticism, 8 years old now, still affect my confidence. That needed to stop. The next day, I presented to the board with complete confidence. Not arrogance, but genuine belief in my capabilities and vision for the company. The board voted unanimously. I was the new COO of TechCore, effective immediately. Harold, stepping back from his CFO role but staying on as an advisor, took me to lunch to celebrate. "You've come a long way from the woman who was put on mandatory leave 8 years ago," he said over steak and wine. "I'm not sure I've come that far. I'm still the same person, just with more scar tissue. That's what experience is, scar tissue. The proof you survived something and learned from it." He raised his glass to scar tissue and second chances. We drank to that. My first 6 months as COO were overwhelming. The learning curve was steep: financial operations, technical infrastructure, facilities management, dozens of areas outside my previous expertise. But I approached it the way I'd approached ethics work, with humility, asking questions, listening to experts, learning voraciously. Priya, now firmly established as VP of HR, became a valuable partner. We worked together on company culture initiatives, ensuring ethics remained central even as operational demands increased. "You know what I appreciate about your leadership," she said during one of our regular check-ins. "You don't pretend to know everything. You admit when you're learning. That makes it easier for everyone else to admit their own knowledge gaps." I learned that from failing publicly. Once everyone knows you've messed up, there's no point pretending to be perfect. 1 year into the COO role, TechCore went through a major crisis. A data breach exposed customer information, creating massive liability and reputational damage. The executive team met in emergency session. Our CEO, Vincent, was panicking, talking about cover-ups, minimal disclosure, protecting the company at all costs. I pushed back immediately. We can't cover this up. We have to disclose fully, take responsibility, fix the problems transparently. That'll cost us millions. Customers will leave. Investors will panic. And covering it up will cost us everything when it inevitably comes out. We'll lose customers, investors, and our integrity. There's only one right choice here. Vincent looked at me with frustration. You're thinking like an ethics officer, not a COO. COOs protect the company's interests. I am protecting the company's interests. Long-term interests. Integrity isn't optional, it's foundational. We either handle this honestly or we destroy trust permanently. The room was silent. Every executive watching to see who would win this power struggle. Finally, Harold spoke up. Catherine's right. We disclose fully, take our lumps, fix the problems. It's the only sustainable path forward. The board agreed. We disclosed the breach completely, notified all affected customers, implemented new security measures, and accepted the financial consequences. It was expensive, tens of millions in direct costs, plus customer loss and reputational damage, but we survived. And 18 months later, our transparency during the crisis became a case study in ethical corporate response. That felt like vindication of everything I'd learned. Blake had claimed my focus on ethics was pointless, that real business was about building things, not managing feelings and policies. But ethics had saved TechCore during its biggest crisis, had protected long-term value even when short-term costs were enormous, had proven that integrity was good business, not just good morals. 3 years into the COO role, I received an unexpected email from Blake. Catherine, I'm writing to tell you that I'm retiring. At 48, which probably seems young, but Sophia and I want to travel while we're still healthy. I've saved enough, invested wisely, and I'm ready for the next chapter. I wanted you to know because your decision to report me 8 years ago made this possible. Forcing me to rebuild my career honestly meant building it on sustainable foundations. Thank you for that. I hope you're well, Blake. I stared at that email for a long time. Blake was retiring at 48 while I was still working 60-hour weeks as COO, still building my career, still proving myself. Part of me felt envious, wondered if I should have made different choices, prioritized differently, built toward early retirement instead of continuous advancement. But mostly, I felt happy for him and happy for myself. We'd taken different paths from the ruins of our marriage. His led to financial security and early retirement. Mine led to professional achievement and industry respect. Neither path was better. They were just different. Different people, different values, different definitions of success. I replied, "Congratulations on your retirement. I hope travel and whatever comes next brings you joy. Thank you for your honesty about how consequences shaped your path. It helps me make peace with difficult decisions I made. Be well." Catherine, that exchange felt like the final closing of a door that had been slowly swinging shut for years. Blake was moving on to a completely different life. I was moving forward in mine. Our orbits no longer intersected. That was healthy. Good. Right. 4 years after becoming COO, Vincent announced his retirement. The board began searching for a new CEO. I was approached about applying. CEO. The top position. Ultimate responsibility for everything. I discussed it with Dr. Barnes during one of our now quarterly sessions. Do you want it? She asked. I don't know. Part of me thinks I should want it. It's the logical next step. But another part wonders if I'm just chasing titles to prove something. Prove what? That Blake was wrong about me, that my work matters, that I'm valuable. Catherine, you've been proving that for 10 years. You don't need CEO to validate your worth. So the question isn't whether you should want it, the question is whether you actually want it. I thought about that for several days. Imagined my life as CEO, the pressure, the responsibility, the public scrutiny, the board oversight, the constant demands. And I realized something. I didn't want it. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I was happy where I was. COO gave me operational influence without ultimate accountability. Let me work on systems and culture without being the public face of the company. I liked that balance, valued it, didn't want to give it up for a title and more money. So I withdrew from consideration and supported the board's external hire, a brilliant executive named Victoria, who brought fresh perspective and complementary skills. Working with Victoria as her COO was the best professional relationship I'd had. She valued my experience, trusted my judgment, gave me autonomy while providing clear direction. You could have had my job, she said 6 months into her tenure. Why didn't you want it? Because this job is actually what I want. I like being number 2. I like focusing on operations and culture without being the ultimate decision maker. CEO would have been a promotion I didn't actually want. That's wise. Most people chase titles without thinking about whether the role actually fits them. I learned that lesson the hard way. Spent years doing work that looked impressive but made me miserable. Now I'm doing work I love, even if it's not the top title. 5 years after becoming COO, I was invited to give a TED Talk. The topic? What I learned from destroying my husband's career. It was provocative, controversial, exactly the kind of title that would get attention. I debated whether to accept. Did I want to be known primarily for that story, defined by my biggest professional and personal failure? But ultimately, I accepted, because the story mattered, because the lessons were valuable, because other people needed to hear that consequences and growth coexist. The talk was scheduled for 6 months out. I spent that time crafting it carefully, balancing honesty with wisdom, acknowledging pain while celebrating growth. Angela came to the taping, sitting in the front row. Afterward, she hugged me tightly. That was perfect. Hard, but perfect. You didn't shy away from how much you wanted revenge, but you also showed how consequences benefited everyone involved. That's real wisdom. The talk went viral when it posted. Millions of views, thousands of comments, articles analyzing my story and its implications. Some people criticized me, said I'd been vindictive, cruel, that I'd destroyed a man's career over hurt feelings. Others praised me, said I'd upheld professional standards despite personal costs, that Blake deserved everything he got. Both were partially right. I had been vindictive. I had upheld standards. Those things coexisted. One comment stood out from Blake's account. The speaker was my ex-wife. Everything she says here is true. I committed fraud, she reported it. I faced appropriate consequences. Those consequences made me examine my entire approach to honesty and integrity. I'm now retired at 52, happily married, at peace with who I am. Sometimes the hardest consequences are the most necessary. Thank you, Catherine, for caring enough to hold me accountable. Reading that comment made me cry for the first time in years. Not sad tears, but release tears. Blake understood. Really understood. We'd both grown from that painful situation. That was redemption. Not revenge, not vindication, but mutual growth through mutual pain. My phone rang. Private number, Catherine Warren. Miss Warren, this is Senator Phillips's office. The Senator is putting together a task force on corporate ethics and accountability. Your name came up repeatedly as someone with both practical experience and thoughtful perspective. Would you be interested in serving on this task force? A government task force? Using my experience, both my successes and failures to shape policy at a national level? Yes, I said without hesitation. I'd be very interested. That conversation led to a year of flying to Washington monthly, working with other experts to develop recommendations on corporate governance, whistleblower protections, conflict of interest policies. My story, the Blake story, became a key case study in our recommendations. Used to illustrate both the importance of clear policies and the necessity of consistent enforcement. The task force's report was published and widely cited. Several states adopted our recommendations into law. We'd created real change, real impact, real improvement in how companies handled ethical situations. That felt like the full circle moment. I'd started with a massive ethical failure, approving Blake's contract without disclosure, had compounded it with arguably vengeful reporting of his fraud, had faced consequences and learned from them. And now those lessons were shaping policy that would affect millions of people. My failure had become useful. My growth had become instructive. That was redemption. Complete, hard-won, meaningful redemption. 10 years after reporting Blake, I was 52 years old. Still COO at TechCore, still speaking regularly about ethics and leadership, still learning and growing. I'd never remarried, had dated occasionally, had a few relationships that lasted months or years, but nothing that made me want permanent commitment again. I was happy alone, had built a life I loved, meaningful work, close friendships, financial security, personal peace. That was enough, more than enough. One evening, sitting in my apartment with wine and classical music, I thought about the woman I'd been at the barbecue 10 years ago. Hearing Blake mock my career, feeling rage and hurt and determination to make him understand his mistake, that woman had gotten exactly what she wanted. Blake had faced devastating consequences, had learned his lesson thoroughly, but she'd also lost her marriage, nearly lost her career, spent years working through guilt and shame and complicated emotions. Was it worth it? 10 years later? Would I make the same choices? Yes. Unequivocally yes. Not because revenge felt good it hadn't. Not really. But because maintaining integrity had felt necessary. Essential, non-negotiable. Blake had committed fraud. I'd reported it. Those were the facts, stripped of all emotion and context. Everything else, the hurt feelings, the desire for vindication, the careful timing, the strategic documentation, those were human complications of a simple ethical situation. I'd learned to live with those complications, to acknowledge them without letting them define the entire situation. That was maturity, that was growth, that was wisdom earned through pain. My phone buzzed. Text from Victoria. Board meeting tomorrow. They want to discuss succession planning for when I retire in 3 years. You should think about whether CEO interests you now. Your answer might have changed. I smiled. 3 years ago, I'd said no to CEO. Now the board wanted to know if that answer was still no. I thought about it for all of 30 seconds before replying. My answer hasn't changed. I love being cool. I don't want your job. But thank you for asking. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Success wasn't about titles or proving people wrong or getting revenge on those who'd underestimated you. Success was knowing yourself well enough to choose the right path, having integrity enough to maintain it despite costs, being honest enough to acknowledge mistakes and wise enough to learn from them. Blake had called my job pointless. His application had said under review and then permanently denied. But my journey had said growth, wisdom, impact, peace. That was the best revenge. Not his downfall, but my rise. Not his suffering, but my thriving. Not vindication through his destruction, but validation through my own construction of a life and career I was genuinely proud of. 10 years later, I could finally say with complete honesty, I'd won. We'd both won. Because we'd both become better people through the painful process of destroying each other and rebuilding separately. That was the real ending. Messy, complicated, human, real, and absolutely perfect.